Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Dr. Patrick Campbell, and I serve as the Senior Director of Research at the Pharmacy Quality Alliance, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator for this session. We're excited to hear about a new report released by the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center, better known as the MRCT Center. The report is on diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical research. And today we are excited to have two fantastic speakers. Dr. Bierer is a faculty director of the MRCT Center at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, a professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and a hematologist-oncologist. She is also director of the Regulatory Foundations, Ethics, and the Law Program of the Harvard Clinical and Translational Science Center and the director of Regulatory Policy, SMART IRB. Sarah White joined the MRCT Center as the executive director in January 2018 and is responsible for developing, defining, and implementing the overall strategy and vision for the center, as well as oversee all management aspects. Sarah has almost 20 years of experience in human subjects research, including academic medical centers and in industry. So I'll hand it over to...
Hi, good. Thank you. Thank you, Patrick, so much for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah White, and I'm the executive director here at the MRCT Center. Dr. Bierer and I very much appreciate this opportunity to speak at today's symposium. Dewan, thank you so much for your words. They inspire all of us to keep working in this area. Our plan this morning is to introduce, as Patrick said, our work in achieving diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical research. I'll do that first, and then Dr. Bierer will address how we sought to make progress in this area, including the focus on patient and community engagement and health literacy. Next slide. So this is our disclaimer. The MRCT Center is supported by voluntary contributions as well as by grants. We are committed to the autonomy of our research and the transparency in our relationships. The center and the directors retain the responsibility and control of the contents of any product's results and deliverables. And we don't have personal or financial conflicts of interest relevant to this presentation. Next slide. I'd like to briefly introduce the MRCT Center for those of you who we haven't worked with to date. We are a research and policy center focused on addressing the conduct, oversight, and ethics and regulatory environment in clinical trials. Next slide. Our vision is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. And we do this by engaging diverse stakeholders to help us define emerging issues in clinical trials to create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. Our work to date has led to the implementation of best practices, greater transparency, and improved safety for research participants. And our resources and tools are freely and openly available on our website. The MRCT Center's work spans 4 areas that address the pressing issues of multi-regional clinical trials. Throughout our work over the past 10 years, we have recognized the need to focus on and with the participant, and that is really reflected in the work that we have taken on and the deliverables that we've had in post-trial access to medicines, in return of results, both aggregate and individual results back to the research participant, in health literacy, and now in diversity. Next slide. We are delighted for colleagues on the symposium today to join us by visiting our website or look to our social media platforms. Next slide. I think few, if any, of the attendees today need introduction to the health disparities of race and ethnicity in the COVID-19 pandemic. The keynote, Ken Frazier, highlighted this. Lavarne and Kenny also just touched on this. Really looking at the minority groups that have endured higher rates of COVID, as you can see on the left, top left, and when adjusted for age, race, and ethnicity, that gap widens. Next slide. This disparity, as all of you know, has extended into clinical trials. This is something that the MRCT Center has been watching very closely. We think about it a lot, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these headlines that you see here. Next slide. This slide and these metrics show a series of figures that date back to 2015 and 2016. These metrics come out of the FDA's Global Participation in Clinical Trials report. It's part of the larger FDA snapshot effort that we have seen since 2015. And in looking at the participation rates of Black or African American individuals in clinical trials across a variety of conditions, you can see the rates are low, as a number of people have already pointed out. This sort of data began to really fuel our interest, our attention, and our work in this area. Next slide, please. So with those and other metrics, we formed the MRCT Center's Clinical Diversity Work Group in late 2017 with this background, that clinical trials are needed to develop new treatments and new vaccines, that participants in trials should reflect the population affected by the disease and those intended to use the intervention, that individuals don't always respond similarly to interventions, underrepresentation of race and ethnic minorities, underserved populations, whether it's sex, gender, or age range at either end of the spectrum is not new. It persists in both industry and academic trials and across therapeutic areas. That race and ethnicity are not biological determinants, but social determinants of health and have real impact on biology. And that diverse representation in clinical trials is not simply a matter of biology, but a matter of health, equity, fairness, and public trust. Next slide. We were delighted to release our Achieving Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity in Clinical Research Guidance Document and Toolkit at the beginning of August. Since then, we have been speaking and really trying to disseminate this to as many people as possible. The document is available on our website and will soon be available in hard copy via Amazon self-publishing. Next slide. This document was the main deliverable of a 2.5-year journey with our diversity work group. It was led by Richarde Araujo at USFDA, Barbara Bierer from the MRCT Center, Luther Clark from Merck, Milena Lolik from the USFDA, David Strauss from Columbia University, and myself from the MRCT Center. Our internal MRCT Center staff, their massive efforts, along with the invaluable contributions of over 50 work group members who represent a very diverse stakeholder group. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that these are the members of the work groups. They included members from patient and patient advocate organizations, academia, pharma, CRO, nonprofit, academia, government and research institutes. You can see their names and their affiliations, but we note that our work group members serve in their individual capacity on the work groups. Next slide, please. The diversity guidance and toolkit is a long and incredibly comprehensive document. Dr. Bierer is going to give you a glimpse into the content. 20 or 30 minutes won't do it justice on the level of detail and the scope of what we really took on in doing this. But a common theme that I hope those in the patient and participant advocacy world can relate to as they look through our work is that our work, everyone's work, really starts with evidence, information, and trust. That data must include the population affected, that our work starts with public and community engagement, and by doing that early, clinical trials should, would, and can address questions of importance to the community, be designed with study outcomes that people care about, use language and words that people understand, be conducted in ways that decrease burden for the participants, and communicate results to those communities that are affected in ways that they can understand. We don't place the responsibility on any individual stakeholder. We think everyone in the clinical research ecosystem is accountable. That is reflected in this guidance document and toolkit. Next slide, please. The guidance document is mindfully divided into distinct sections. It includes a preface that contains an executive summary. Parts A and B really address a more conceptual approach to issues of diversity. It builds a case for diversity from various angles and includes the business value of inclusion. And then starting with part C, the guidance document pivots and approaches the issue of diversity in a very practical way. It walks the reader and the user through aspects and elements of product development and clinical trial life cycle where we all can make progress. The sections are meant to offer practical recommendations and tools for stakeholders to use as they do their work. The last part, the toolkit, is meant to offer new tools and resources that aren't available out in the clinical research enterprise right now, very much meant to be downloaded and implemented into the work. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bierer to talk about how we move forward.
Thank you, Sarah. And again, it's my pleasure to present to you. This is couldn't be a better group to discuss this work with, and because I think it begins and ends with the patient and the community and serving those affected with the disease or condition. So when we started this work 2.5 years ago, we really had a broad definition of diversity, not just race and ethnicity, sex and gender, but social determinants of health, genetics, comorbidities, concurrent medications, because many times in clinical trials, people with comorbidities or concurrent medications are excluded. And I have to say that we took the position that, you know, the group we were focusing on was everyone involved in the clinical trial enterprise. It's not specific to patients and advocates. It's not specific to industry or to academia. We wanted to make sure that we addressed all the aspects insofar as we could at the time to allow for people to make progress where they could. So as Sarah says, it's a very practical document. But with that broad definition of diversity, one really must appreciate that these dimensions don't exist independently. You know, a Black woman is not the same demographic or experience as a white woman, nor is it similar to a Black man. And one can continue to make these subgroups ever more complex and ever more refined, and actually build upon towards a definition of personalized medicine that is, after all, where we hope to end up. But in a clinical trial, and our focus was exclusively on clinical trials, you know, we can't power the trial to get statistical evidence for each of those very many relevant subgroups. So we need to find ways of using the data in aggregate and then be able to parse it and have dimensions of that data that suggest how we're going to approach the future work that we need to do. But in order to do that at all, one needs to involve patients that are representative of the disease and or the condition under study or those intended to utilize or use the intervention. And for that, there have been many reports of different barriers that confront each of us and all of us in terms of greater participation. For sponsors, stakeholders, sites, and regulators, there's a lack of engagement with the community, the lack of diverse workforce, which Ken Fraser has already touched on. There's travel time and cost and a fear of that being exorbitant, and variable regulatory expectations for investigators, referring physicians, and staff. There's really an uncertain scientific utility of inclusion. If you can't get statistically relevant results, then why do it at all, kind of thing. There are eligibility criteria that are clearly limiting. The site feasibility is usually overestimating the number of patients that can be accrued, and inadequate staffing and time constraints don't allow people to spend the time that they wish to spend. There are challenges for recruitment and retention. And then frankly, the staff itself is not diverse, and many of them have not been trained in cultural competencies. In data collection, there's a lack of data standards. In fact, over 50% of those enrolled in COVID clinical research have not had race and ethnicity entered onto certain data collection variables, for instance. We need to commit to common data standards so that the data is interoperable when we get there. And for patients and advocates, as has been touched on before, there's a lack of awareness often, a lack of access. Study design and research is often burdensome. The outcomes are uncertain, and the logistics of trial conduct are challenging. There's payment and other considerations, and undergirding all of that is an element of mistrust and distrust that comes from a honest historical experience. But all of these barriers are able to be addressed, and it starts, in our opinion, with patient and community engagement that supports diverse participation. And importantly, that means forming relationships with the patient and community to be in key leadership roles as advisors and as consultants. That has to be a long-term trusting relationship. It cannot be where investigators swoop into the community, take what they need, and disappear. If one can't have trusting relationships, then one needs a trusted intermediary to have those relationships with whom the academic investigator or industry partner can interact. We also need to offer training and support so that really patient perspectives can influence research priorities and questions, and that they feel empowered to bring their lived experience to the table. And finally, there has to be shared goals to seek input to tailor the study design and conduct to improve access, enrollment, and retention. As I mentioned, these are sustained partnerships, or should be, and we need to build those partnerships, not with individuals, but also with communities, and patient advocacy organizations are a key part of that, and all as an element to build trust. I have to say, just in case I forget later, that we are looking to partner with the patient advocacy community, and we'll discuss that again a little bit later. So if one looks at a patient's clinical trial journey, there's awareness, access, recruitment, screening, then somebody who is aware and able to join the trial, has informed consent, the participant is on study, there's additional testing and sometimes randomization, on study visits, the last patient visits, but then of course there's follow-up after that visit, and the trial may not end at that time, but rather only when the last patient last visit, data lock and data analysis. If one looks at that from the patient's perspective, one can look at early interventions that one could think through, and that involves patient and community engagement, education and health literacy, appropriate feasibility assessments, eligibility criteria that are sufficiently broad. Study conduct, incredibly important for the patient and participants. And again, many things that one could do to make that less burdensome, including study design that makes sure that we're asking and addressing questions of importance. We should think through the informed consent process and document logistical issues, which I'll touch upon. Of course, one thing that we've learned in the COVID-19 pandemic is how to decentralize trials and only have patients visit where those visits are essential. If you think about the fact that we used to ask patients to drive 2 hours, to sit in the waiting room for 40 minutes, to get to front of a doctor to say, how you doing? And the patient says, well, I've been fine, actually. They say, thanks. Then they get back in the car for another 2 hours. That is all doable over the phone or on a video conference call. Payment, transportation, childcare, and making arrangements for that. We need, as I mentioned, standardized data collection. We have to ensure that we've given adequate consideration to post-trial access to medicines, to return aggregate results of the study, and where possible, individual results. And then we have to make sure that we keep the referring physician engaged and that they are not lost to follow-up because they join a clinical trial, sometimes not within the confines of the referring physician itself. And then finally, at the end of the study, of course, there's data analysis, results reporting, and again, with this circle, community outreach and explaining to the community what was found in this study that people have volunteered to participate in. So we go through in this document many of these individual considerations and how to make progress on each of them. But of course, one clinical trial does not define product development or the understanding of drugs, biologics, and devices, but rather that sits in a larger clinical development program, which both patients and advocates are involved in, and industry is, of course, critical for. That starts with drug discovery and preclinical studies, making sure that those studies represent the full dimensions of diversity insofar as we can. And then after these clinical trials, and there's marketing, there's certainly a role for phase 4 studies, post-marketing development and studies, real-world evidence that then informs these subpopulations, continued pharmacovigilance, and undergirding all of that is workforce development and thinking through how to bring about a more diverse investigator population. If insofar as we cannot sort of snap our fingers and get diverse clinical investigators, we need to make sure that the workforce itself is trained in cultural competence and implicit bias. We need to commit human and financial resources to make this possible. We think that if there is adequate planning to these trials and consideration, that we'll be able to optimize the clinical trial experience and planning such that the time is not longer. The cost may not be more expensive, but it will be more effective. You know, if one adds sites in the middle of a trial, or one needs to extend the time in order to get the appropriate representation, then obviously you're going to delay closure of that trial, and the results may delay product development. With adequate planning and infrastructure, we think that that's going to be possible to avoid. And of course, I'll return to the issue of accountability. So all of this starts with getting patients and their families to understand the clinical trial experience, and that starts with clear communications. We've spent some time on that, and in fact, the project that we did before, the one on diversity, inclusion, and equity, was specifically on health literacy. And if you think about where clear communications play a role, it's not just in the informed consent. There's education and making those aspects of clinical trials, as we heard about in the Kidney Foundation, Kidney Fund, important to have tools and resources available to patients and participants that educate them about clinical trials and what their rights are. And that continues throughout the clinical trial experience. There's the informed consent, as I mentioned, data collection. Each of these issues need, like all the communications for patient instructions, with the research procedures that go on at home and elsewhere have to be clearly presented. And then there's summary data, both aggregate and individual results. So if we think about clear communication, we see it as a shared responsibility. It is not the fact that somebody, the listener, has poor literacy or can't understand. It's the responsibility of the communicator to deliver information that's understandable to the listener. It's our responsibility to make sure that we are understood as investigators and empower the listener to be comfortable asking if there's any lack of understanding and what questions remain. And that's not just for plain literacy, for plain language and using terms that are understandable and in the public domain, but rather numeracy and understanding of risk and numbers, visualization, clear design, cultural considerations, interactive techniques, and teach back so that we can make sure that whatever we've said as an investigator is understood by the participant. And that is for both written and verbal communications. So we've spent a fair amount of time on that. We have a website and tools available for health literacy, which we invite you to look at with the focus on a language understandable to the participant. And indeed, we walk through on this website each of these sort of resources to make it possible to have communications specifically directed to clinical research that are understandable to the participant. Now, that work is continuing. We're working on a glossary so that we use the same terms, whether you're at Merck or the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and that we define those terms and research procedures in ways that are understandable. As a point for this, we developed COVID-19 research flyers at the beginning of the epidemic or pandemic. We found in Boston, it was one of the early hotspots. The patients were literally in the ICU or behind some plexiglass containment and asked to participate in a clinical trial and had no reference and no understanding of what they were being asked to do. So we developed a series of flyers on sort of what questions should I ask the research team before joining the trial? What questions should I feel it's my right to know in order to understand whether or not I want to participate in a clinical trial? We did that for a number of different scenarios. I'm showing one that is about whether, if I'm healthy, should I join? There's also ones, for guardians, for children, for vaccines, and in the spirit of making sure that we work in a language that is understandable to the participant. We've translated them into Spanish and are looking to translate them further. So in addition to clear communications, we think that we should back up and think about trial design to really understand the population, which is based on the epidemiology and disease burden and demographics, to know who is our population that we should be focusing on. And their patient advocate organizations can be really instrumental for us to figure that out as for industry, and to partner with you to understand how to maximize recruitment and retention strategies, minimize the burden of trials. And that is an area that you know better than all of us. I think it's important to access the target population or the intended population to guide where to look for the appropriate participants. We need data-driven strategies. We shouldn't just depend on who our key opinion leaders are and who has been doing trials before, because we know that some of those have not adequately recruited appropriate populations. And then to determine the feasibility of enrollment figures based on data, prior data, we have a feasibility tool in the toolkit, as well as a recruitment plan and guide. If the site, though, fails to recruit the population of interest, we should feel perfectly empowered to help them succeed and to give them tools and resources to help them recruit the appropriate population. We need to think about the targets for enrollment, including those demographics, to assist the sites and support each other. And then later to think about how the recruitment strategies should be informed by patient preferences. We should be taking account of data as it's collected and monitor progress and site progress as well. There are many, many issues in the logistics of clinical trials, as you all know as well. We need to think through quick and easy reimbursement processes. People can't wait 60 days for their check to arrive in the mail. We need to consider compensation for missed work or caregiver support, extend the site hours at a clinic if clinic visits are indeed required, and have flexibility in those appointments. It's helpful to have on-site childcare and elder care to provide transportation or assist with those arrangements. We've talked about health literacy, and then culturally competent and linguistically capable staff. These are only some of the logistical challenges that we've identified and worked through in the report to give practical guidance as to how to do these kinds of things. And that's backed up by, of course, this idea and actualization of changing how we engage the patient and community in awareness, access, and participation to really focus on trust and trustworthiness of the enterprise, which I think we're all committed to here. Eligibility and study design, and we've seen that the eligibility should be only as narrow as required for safety, but as broad as possible. And then we've talked about some of these other issues. There is a real role for innovation in trial design and in thinking about recruitment and retention strategies that will render successful some of the efforts that we're trying. The genetics and the diversity in data sources, I have to say that there is perpetual underrepresentation to date in all the data sources and databases that are typically used, as well as the genetic representation in those databases, which means that machine learning, neural networks, artificial intelligence will derive answers that are not based on the adequate diverse population that we should be studying. And we need to start thinking about, or continue to think about, how to reflect the diversity in the original data sources so that we are appropriately thoughtful about the conclusions that are drawn. And I think that one thing we're conscious of is that all the sort of discussions should start with the patient so that we understand from the individual what will make their participation easier. We have a long section in there about how each component of the enterprise can participate in making a commitment to change and a commitment to diversity and inclusion. We need metrics to make this possible and to work. We need transparency, and we need to be comfortable talking to one another about what we can do to make it possible to hold ourselves and one another accountable for change, and to see that change over time, and to really respect the call to action that we heard about earlier today. part of the beauty of working with a group of people for 2.5 years is that we became very comfortable having very difficult conversations. I think I've become personally more comfortable having those conversations, and I think we need to be able to do that with one another. As evidence that it can be done, we were happy to see that Genentech Roche last Monday reported the results of a phase 3 trial on one of their products for COVID-19 associated pneumonia. 85% of the 389 patients were from minority racial and ethnic groups, majority Hispanic, but a significant representation of Black and African American and Native American populations. I spoke to them about it. One of the members was in the work group. They stood up a new clinical site, trial site in 2 weeks. And that was in a majority minority site and it gave us great sort of comfort that this can be done. So what can each of us do now? I think, we need one step at a time towards change, a 10-point program, a roadmap, whatever it is that will bring about an aspirational vision to really think through how to change our current parameters. We need targeted representation. We're working on recommendations for special populations, the disabled, the young, the elderly, faith-based challenges to participation. We are developing initial tools and resources, and insofar as we can ask you to contribute them, we'll be happy to make them generally available and work with you to develop them as you appreciate what needs to be done. And we need to think about national and international action programs going forward. But committing to inclusion is our first step. And as we say, the real work of change is done year by year, month by month, and day by day by all of us and by each of us. Thank you, and we look forward to working with you. I know that we were unable to do a really deep dive on any of these issues, so we've planned a series of webinars where we do a deep dive into each of these. That's going to be held on Wednesdays, pretty much every other week from 11 to noon Eastern time. And with that, I'm happy to take questions and we can see where the discussion might go. Back to you, Patrick.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We have had a lot of questions that have come in through both the chat as well as in the Q&A section. So just to get us started, earlier in the presentation, you went over some barriers for patient communities to be engaged. So do you have any good practices that you've seen or anything that you can share with the members on the call today that we can overcome some of those barriers? Any case examples?
There are many case examples. We have case studies in the document. I should forewarn you, together between the guidance and the toolkit, it's about 450 pages. So we do have enormous numbers of sort of case examples of success. We don't focus on the failures. I think each of us can appreciate why, as well as very practical and detailed recommendations, both for engagement and for sort of standing for what we know to be true, which is, in the end, if we don't listen to the patients, we're not going to make change. And we're not going to have trials that are responsive to the needs of patients, and we're not going to be using endpoints that matter to patients. One of the things that always impressed me was a story about how industry had always used pain as an endpoint in a certain condition, which I won't go into. And when you ask the patients, it's actually fatigue that makes their day so long. It's not the pain. If you never talk to them, if we never talk together, we're never going to know these things. And as I see on the question and answer, yes, the task force is still going on. We're working on specific populations now and recommendations, but we have a commitment at MRCT Center to continue this work and to work with people that are committed to making change and developing further practical tools.
Great. So I know we're running a little over, but maybe one or two more questions, if that would be great. So one of the questions that came in is, how is the MRCT Center partnering with other organizations like the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative or Patient-Focused Medicines Development or Faster Cures?
So we have always extended invitations broadly through our newsletter. We invite everyone to sign up, and all the projects that we do, we announce through there, as well as announcing continuing efforts and progress. So CTTI, we've been in touch with, we have regular meetings with, and I know that they're thinking about doing something in the space. We've shared our work with them. And Faster Cures we're in touch with as well. So, one of the things that I'm conscious of, particularly for the patient advocacy community, is that these activities are volunteer and everybody has a day job. So, we can only offer the coordination, support, and direction that we're working on. We can't, but everyone, if you're interested, we'd love to talk to you.
Great. Yeah, and some other questions that came up in the Q&A. So how can we advocate for the uptake of these excellent resources and principles by developers of clinical research? Can we get more funders to insist on representative representation and/or reviewers or to let researchers know that representative participation is a requirement for approval? What are your thoughts to that?
So Sarah, let me just answer this one because I'm passionate about it. One of the things that we heard early on in this work was a representative of a CRO saying, a clinical research organization saying, if we were told we had to recruit a diverse population, we would. Now, if that's the case, why isn't it in every contract? Why isn't it in what we review at the IRB, what we review at the institution? Why isn't the institution making that, the sites making their data more generally available? So I think what we need to do is to figure out where those requirements can be pitched so that there's a little bit of a stick, but also the carrot, that when you do this right, there will be, sort of real change going forward.
Yeah, I would just include there as well that we spent a lot of time in this project really trying to develop practical recommendations and tools and case examples so that people in the research community, whether they're in industry, academia, or CROs, really have the tools that they need. I think one of the barriers is really just making sure people know what they can and should do. And if they don't have the tools to do that, or they haven't been educated to do that, they don't even think of how. And so we really spent a lot of time trying to think about how and providing the how to the people.
Great. Well, and thank you so much. There's many more questions that unfortunately we don't have a chance to get through today. But please, everyone, join me in thanking our speakers for this excellent presentation and for their insights. This has been really valuable.
Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to share this.
Thank you.